or speaking to today is going to be focused on, of course, healthcare insight, because that's what is my bread and butter. But I would like this to be something that resonates with other industries as well. So the concepts are a bit general in that regard, to the fact that they can fit with a number of different solutions and industries and applications of AI as well. And essentially taking different frameworks into account that already exist. As we can see from the FDA's action plan, there's a lot of things that are still currently happening to establish the right kind of rigor and regulatory oversight for AI solutions, but there's already a lot of really great frameworks to work with. So namely, the things that I incorporated today include the NIST cybersecurity framework, FDA guidance for pre and post-market submissions for cybersecurity, as well as a number of different other frameworks. You can consider it a bit of alphabet soup with the different acronyms and everything that go into that. But the real core concepts come together, and I think they can establish the right kind of building blocks. And then what we have to do in the context of AI is to establish really how those apply to the systems that we're working in and the unique nature that AI brings to the table there as well. So that being said, I wanted to start off with just more generally, what makes a good compliance framework for cybersecurity? And how can we create something that's adaptable to AI? So the three key characteristics that I look for when I'm establishing a cybersecurity compliance framework or working with clients to do that in my past life is things that are lean, adaptable, and repeatable. So lean, clearly put, things that are simple are a lot more easy to carry out. Especially when you're working across different competencies, working with engineering colleagues, with product management colleagues, it really makes sense to build upon what you already have and complement the existing processes. So if you're already following a certain software development lifecycle, how can you improve upon that and create additions rather than spinning up new processes that are just there for the purposes of compliance? So that really helps people to feel involved in the process, and it helps compliance to be embedded within everything you do. And of course, having lightweight processes reduces the amount of time that individuals in different functions like engineering and product management are actually spending on compliance activities as well. In terms of adaptability, as I had mentioned earlier, we want to be able to have frameworks that are adaptable to different types of industries, but we should also be focusing on different types of compliance as well. So when you're thinking of the healthcare space, I work in cybersecurity compliance, but I work extremely closely with my colleagues in privacy, data protection, quality, safety, as well as regulatory. So all of these represent different needs from the market. And we really need to think about how we can bring those together so it's a consolidated view of our compliance path for all of our products and systems. Regarding the ever-changing world of cybersecurity and data protection and privacy, you've probably heard of things like GDPR or CCPA, again, throwing all of those acronyms at you, but essentially they represent a lot of different regulations and requirements around our use of data. In the context of AI, we need to think about how that changes our approach or produces additional requirements for how we collect data, what we do with it, the requirements for transparency back to users as well. And then for new products or systems or changes to our products and systems, making sure that the framework that we have adapts and can fit to the different types of systems that we're working with, and that it can incorporate the AI components and be adaptable to really the way that we work. We need things to be repeatable. So obviously we have results that are consistent over time. Sometimes you'll hear from compliance colleagues that if it isn't written down, you didn't do it. So the way that we establish that in the compliance world is that we would leverage automation, standard templates to really help the teams to excel, to create things that are consistently done on a periodic basis or when they need to be, and done in the same level of quality that they should be. So this helps the teams to really understand what's required of them in terms of compliance. Compliance is something that is a requirement of everyone involved. It's not necessarily just your compliance team. So really empowering the rest of the teams in a cross-functional fashion to make sure that they know what's expected and they can be educated and trained on that process too. And of course, this helps you when you're approaching audits or regulatory submissions as well. You have all of your documentation together, it's consistent, and you feel confident that it's fulfilling the needs that it's supposed to. So now that we've established what we think is a good framework and what we think are the key building blocks to building this, the next steps are going to be what you actually have to do to carry out that framework, and especially in the context of AI for security. I always find that it's very important to start with identifying what you have within your environment. I'll refer to that as assets and processing activities, but the key concept here is if you don't know what you have and what you'd like to do with it, it's very hard to protect it. So that being said, once you know kind of the context and scope of your environment, you'll move on to assessing the cybersecurity risk. Cybersecurity risk should focus on confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data and the systems that you're working with. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as CIA. Based on the risks that you have, you'll be responsible for mitigating those risks. So you do that by implementing different controls and procedures. These could be things that you build into your system design, but also actions that you carry out as well. And one really important aspect to this is continuously monitoring the environment. This goes back to some of the FDA action plan regarding the use of real-world data to continuously monitor, but also in the context of cybersecurity specifically, when we're thinking of monitoring, are you monitoring the availability of your system? Are you looking at potential vulnerabilities? Are you able to react when those things happen? And the real benefit, I think, of having that core continuous monitoring helps you to establish when there is an event or something changes or you've identified a discrepancy, can you go back to some of those earlier stages around the identification and the risk levels to modify appropriately? And that points back to the adaptability of your framework itself, is that it should take a number of these different considerations into account. So first, focusing on the identify piece. Again, if we don't know what we have, we can't protect it. Thinking of that, when I say assets, I'm referring to data assets as well as system assets. Establishing these off the bat will help you to understand from the data perspective, what are you collecting in the context of your AI system? And how do you really get that data in? And what does that look like throughout the data lifecycle? Also establishing what systems will be processing that data, what are your interfaces. That helps you to know what systems need to be considered within the scope and have controls applied against them. It also identifies what your entry points are and what your attack surface looks like as well. In addition to the assets themselves, so much of the importance here comes from the actual processing activities. And that really gives the context to not only what you have and what you need to protect, but what you're doing with it and why that frames things specifically for different data protection regulations. So for example, if you're collecting personal data and you want to use it in your system, you need to think about the individuals that data would be coming from, how you're collecting that, what types of systems and individuals might come into contact that with within the data lifecycle, as well as the different considerations. Maybe you have GDPR applicability for Europe in regards to how you can consider that data anonymized or de-identified if that's your goal with the data as well. So really understanding what your desires are with the processing activities, the different business activities that supports, it's super important to build that profile. So moving down the image, we need to look at the actual data types and the classification levels and what significance that has in your environment, the different applicable data protection regulations. That also has a bearing on the transparency that you have to provide back to users, and just generally lawfully what you can do with certain data and how you can collect it as well. Your system architecture and design considerations are particularly important. You need to make sure that you have collaboration between your compliance activities and your engineering teams to ensure that the right design considerations are thought about upfront before you get too far down the process. And of course, having this environment identified and all of these factors really pinpointed upfront, they might evaluate and change over time, but that's part of why you have your continuous monitoring in place. But really what those seek to do is to inform your risk profile. And that moves into the next stage here. We see that we're moving a little bit down the picture. And this helps to frame, what are the different CIA risks to your system, to the data involved? And really, you need to be thinking about risk from a couple different angles. So if we're thinking about a risk to potentially someone gaining access to a database, this could be a risk to the personal rights and freedoms of individuals. So that could be a potential data breach. But in the context of AI, what we also have to think about is the downstream impacts to what it means if someone accesses certain data. So say if that's your training data set, if someone's manipulating that data, it could cause compromise to your model and to the outputs that's actually producing. So in turn, in a system in the healthcare space, that could be a security risk, a privacy risk, and then also potentially a safety risk. So we need to think about things both from the angles that someone could attack, what it means to the system from a security perspective, and then the downstream or complementary inputs to different compliance areas as well. And what I wanted to really show, and I don't always see this within different frameworks, is the fact that risks need to be applied to the various lifecycle activities. These might look a little bit different depending what your system's doing, but those blue boxes below are really showing the different aspects of your solution over time. So if you're establishing your requirements, you're building the system, you're training your algorithms, and you're optimizing, validating, and deploying your system. Each of those are separate activities, and they actually require separate types of protections in place. So similar to how the identify phase informed our risk profile, we need to think about how your risk profile then informs the activities and controls that you put in place downstream from there. So for each of these aspects, I'm not going to go into great detail with these, but I would like to point out that as part of the requirements phase, that's where you should really have your compliance team involved. You need to make sure that requirements are put in place to ensure that any system that you build for AI is incorporating the appropriate access restrictions, requirements for high availability and recoverability. And then you can pinpoint for the different activities like your build, how do you incorporate different protections for example, code scanning and making sure you're assessing vulnerabilities in that regard. Moving on to training, making sure that your training data is kept safe from being manipulated or compromised. In the validation phase, you want to make sure that your system's actually being validated from the different potential attackers. So that could be external or internal attackers. You can do that through vulnerability scanning as well as penetration testing. But you ultimately need to decide based on your solution, what's the right way to test and what's the right amount of testing that needs to be done. For AI deployment, this is particularly important because we need to make sure that we're securely deploying, but also deploying in a way that helps to set us up for success with the continuous monitoring piece. So you need to be building solutions with the right kind of concepts to identify different potential threats to your environment. So I'll use vulnerability detection for an example. So if you set up your system to identify vulnerabilities, you need to have a mechanism to then alert your team. And essentially, then that's supported by policy and procedure development. Once you get a vulnerability, it's great if you know about it, but if you don't know the right thing to do with it, that can be extremely problematic. So based on your regulatory requirements, you might have different bounds for what you have to do with vulnerability. So it could be the amount of time that you have to respond to something, the different notification or communication requirements to different parties. So knowing those things up front and baking them both into how you build your system and then how you actually establish procedures and requirements is extremely important too. And I always like to have education, training, and awareness as kind of that bottom line. It's really great if you have good design in your system, if you have the right procedures, but if people aren't trained on them, it's very, very difficult to actually carry those out. So then moving forward to the continuous monitoring piece. As I had mentioned, we have obviously all of these steps to really focus on the identification piece. What are we focusing on in our environment? What are we really trying to protect? How does that inform our risk profile? How do we have controls in place around the design and the operation of the different security components? It all really comes together once you incorporate that continuous monitoring. If you don't know about the health of your system, then it's very difficult for you to be protecting against things. Okay, so I know I went through that rather quickly, but I also wanted to give some time for discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. And so at this point, if we could open up the we'll unmute everybody. We also have Matthew Diamond here from the FDA. If there are any questions, or Matthew, if you'd like to add anything on the new AI action plan, we can kick that off.
And this is Marla. Just to let everyone know, you now have microphone rights, so you can unmute your microphone and just start talking. So any reactions you have to what Emily presented or questions, and then as Simon said, Matthew's on the line from FDA and could certainly field questions, or Matthew, if you want to make any comments about the FDA action plan. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Marla. Thanks, Simon. And you can hear me okay now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And thanks, Emily, for a really nice presentation overall, and a nice overview of the action plan. One thing that I just wanted to highlight is part of our intention in publishing this document was, first of all, to very proactively state a set of priorities for the center and the agency in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And also to lay out a number of initiatives that we really welcome collaboration, and this group and the larger family of Xavier sponsored efforts, I think is a great way. We highlight in the action plan the work that has already been done in good machine learning practice. But as an example, in our effort to promote transparency, we do intend to host a public workshop in that area, and we really would welcome folks' participation and input and feedback on the plan as well. The plan was developed, as Emily mentioned, following on the 2019 discussion paper that we issued, and utilizing all the feedback received on that. But I just wanted to underscore, we're open for additional feedback, suggested direction, and most of all, collaboration, because many of these efforts really do take a community to advance. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Do we have any questions for either Emily or Matthew?
Well, one thing I saw in the, and I guess I could share my video. I didn't want to distract from Emily's presentation, but one thing I see in the chat box is a question from Matthew. It says, can the guidelines in the action plan for AI machine learning based software as a medical device be extended to models in the drug manufacturing area?
Thanks very much for the question. So, the action plan was issued by the CDRH Digital Health Center of Excellence, where our focus is on medical devices. And, as you saw, the action plan specifically focused on software as a medical device, or SAMD. We thought this was the right place to begin, but clearly we feel like many of the approaches and principles can be applied more broadly, and sort of a natural place to start is within our own world of devices to embedded software as well. beyond devices. Many of the AI/ML tools can play a really important role in the development of other products, like pharmaceuticals, and in manufacturing. So, I think many of the principles and approaches can be applied to many different sectors. I would defer to my colleagues at the Drug Center to talk more about that specifically, but we do collaborate, clearly across the agency with them, and I think we'd like to do that even more moving forward. So I know I'm not providing a lot of specifics here, except to say I think it's a good question and makes sense.
Thank you.